In the winter of 1847, high in the Medicine Bow Range, everyone said Josiah Hatcher was building his cabin wrong. Decades later, folks realized he might have been the only one who truly understood the wind. That first season, however, was a misery he thought would be his last. The cold was not just an absence of heat. It was a presence, a physical weight that pressed against the new-felled lodgepole pine of his small cabin. Hatcher, a man in his 40s who had spent 20 years trapping beaver until the trade collapsed, had built this shelter with his own hands, the way he had been taught, the way every other man in the valley built his. He had felled the trees in the late summer, skidded them with his mule, and notched them tight, fitting them with the rhythmic precision of his well-kept broadaxe. The axe, its heavy head worn smooth and dark with use, was his most trusted possession. It represented order and craft in a world that offered neither. Yet it had failed him. Or rather, the knowledge behind his use of it had failed him. He sat on his low stool, feeding split pine into the small stone fireplace. The fire roared, but the heat seemed to travel no more than 5 feet before the mountain cold snatched it. He was burning wood at a rate that was unsustainable. He would spend half his daylight hours, precious and short, simply felling and hauling more fuel, just to keep the night from killing him. The wind found its way in. It was a high, thin shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He had chinked the gaps between the logs with the best mix he knew: river clay, dried moss, and a little bison dung. But the green logs were shrinking as they dried in the frozen air, and the chinking, brittle with frost, cracked and fell away in small chunks. He could see his breath, not just near the door, but in the very center of the room. He walked to the north-facing wall, the one that took the full force of the prevailing wind. He placed his bare hand on the rounded log. It was so cold it burned, sticky and sharp. He could feel the cold radiating inward. It was as if the log itself was a conduit, a bridge, pulling the 20-degree air from the outside and delivering it directly into his living space. His axe leaned against that same wall, its metal head coated in a thick white rime of interior frost. He looked at the tool, then at the wall it had shaped. He had done everything right, but the result was all wrong. This wasn't a shelter. It was a trap. It was a box that collected cold. He realized, with a sinking dread, that the common wisdom was not wisdom at all. It was just habit. And here, at 9 Arrowsarn feet, habit was a death sentence. That spring, after a winter spent in a state of shivering exhaustion, Josiah Hatcher reviewed his failure. He had survived, but barely. He had spent more time maintaining his shelter than living in it. He had rechinked the walls a dozen times, using a frozen slurry of clay and snow, his hands cracked and bleeding inside his mittens. He had burned through a staggering pile of wood, depleting the small aspen grove he had counted on for years of fuel. The problem, he reasoned, was fundamental. He had built his cabin the standard way, just as Silas, his nearest neighbor 5 miles down the valley, had done. They had sourced their timber together. They had used the same techniques: a simple saddle notch at the corners, a single wall of 8-inch logs, and a shallow pitched roof of split shakes. It was a design that worked well enough in the Ohio River Valley or the hills of Tennessee, where the winters were wet and mild. But here, the cold was dry, penetrating, and backed by relentless wind. Silas had complained of the same thing. "It's the chinking, Hatcher," Silas had insisted, spitting tobacco juice onto the melting snow. "Just got to redaub every fall. It's the price of admission." Josiah shook his head. It wasn't just the chinking. He had watched the wind. He had seen how the fine, sugary snow was driven through the tiniest cracks, but he had also felt the conduction through the solid wood. The logs, which he had thought of as a solid barrier, were acting like sponges for the cold. His fireplace was fighting the entire thermal mass of the mountain. He remembered one night, in the depth of January, when a skin of water he'd left near the west wall had frozen solid, even as the fireplace roared bright enough to read by. He had built a structure that was thermally indefensible. His internal monologue was a loop of frustration. Why did a single log feel warm in the summer sun, but become a river of cold in the winter? It was the same wood. He thought about his tools, his broadaxe. He had spent weeks hewing the inside face of each log flat, a point of pride that was supposed to make the cabin feel more finished, more civilized. Now he saw the vanity in it. That flat face was just a wider, more efficient surface to dump cold into his room. He had wasted his labor on aesthetics when he should have been focused on physics. The standard method was wrong. It assumed the wood was the insulation, but it wasn't. The wood was just the structure. Something else was needed. He didn't know what, but he knew he couldn't face another winter in that icebox. He had to find a different way, or he would leave, defeated. His search for a new idea began not with men, but with the earth. One early summer day, while digging a new privy hole, he was struck by the temperature of the soil. A few feet down, the ground was cool, but not frozen. It was stable. He thought of the bear den he'd found years ago, dug back into a hillside. The animal survived the whole winter not by fighting the cold, but by using the earth to escape it. Later, he was checking a trap line near a beaver dam. He plunged his arm into the side of the massive lodge, pulling out mud and sticks. The inside of the lodge, even with the water below, felt damp but remarkably insulated. The beavers had used a thick, chaotic mass of mud and wood to create a barrier. His own neat, tidy logs looked paltry in comparison. The real breakthrough, however, came from a man. Josiah traveled to the trading post at Fort Laramie to sell his few spring pelts and buy powder and flour. While there, he watched a group of German immigrants building a small structure. They weren't using logs. They were building a heavy timber frame, a Fachwerk, and filling the spaces between the timbers with a strange mixture of wet clay and straw. Josiah approached the eldest, a man named Anselm Muller, who was tamping the mixture into the wall with a wooden mallet. "That won't hold the wind," Josiah said, gesturing to the wet, gray infill. Anselm wiped his brow and looked at Josiah's buckskins. "It is not for the wind," the German said in thick English. "It is for the cold. The wood is the bone. This," he patted the Stuffung. "This is the meat. It holds the warm. Air cannot move inside." He then pointed to a pile of stone. "But first, the stone. You must lift the wood from the wet earth." Another man, a Swede who had joined the conversation, added his own wisdom. "In my country," he said, "we build with logs, but for the cold farms, 2 walls. 1 wall for the house, 1 wall to stop the wind. In the middle, we put the moss, the dry moss. The cold gets lost in the moss." Josiah stood there, the pieces clicking into place. The snowdrift, the beaver lodge, the Germans' Stuffung, the Swedes' moss wall. The problem was not his logs. The problem was that he had only 1 wall. He needed a space. He needed a gap. He needed to create a wall whose only job was to hold stillness. He realized the Arapaho, whose teepees he had often seen, understood this perfectly. They used an inner liner, a second wall of hide, separated from the outer cover by a foot of air. This liner stopped drafts, but it also trapped the warm air from the fire, letting it rise slowly and exit at the top. Everyone understood this principle but him. Josiah Hatcher returned to his cabin in the Medicine Bow, not with resignation, but with a fierce, calculating energy. He would not tear his cabin down. That would be a waste of a full season's labor. He would add to it. He would build a second cabin, a ghost wall, around the first. He spent the evenings of that summer sketching on the back of a depleted ledger, using a stub of charcoal. He would build a new, lighter frame of 6x6 timbers, completely surrounding his existing cabin, but separated from it by a gap. How wide? He paced it out. His hand, from thumb to pinky, was about 8 inches. That seemed right. A thick, protective buffer. This outer frame would be structural, but its main purpose was to create a cavity. And into that cavity, he would place his insulation. But what? He thought of the Swede, dry moss. He thought of the German, clay and straw. He thought of the prairie sodbusters, who used the earth itself. He experimented. He gathered bushels of dry moss from the north side of the trees. He used his axe and a draw knife to create piles of wood shavings. He dug dry, powdery clay from a riverbank and pulverized it. He decided on a mix. A layer of dry moss, which was light and trapped air, alternating with a layer of tamped dry earth and sawdust, which would be dense, prevent settling, and deter mice. He would build his insulation in layers, like a cake. His neighbors, Silas and a new family named Dunn, watched his preparations. "You building a fortress, Hatcher?" Silas called out. "That's a powerful lot of wood for a cabin that's already built." Josiah just nodded, sharpening his broadaxe. "Building it for the wind," he replied. The planning was obsessive. He realized the outer wall didn't even need to be logs. It could be rough-sawn planks, which would be faster. He made a deal with the new sawmill down at the fort, trading a winter's worth of meat for 1,000 board feet of pine. He would build the outer frame, sheath the outside of that frame with the planks, and then fill the 8-inch gap from the top, tamping it down as he went. No, that was wrong. The fill would settle. He had to build the outer skin upwards, filling the cavity as he went. He'd attach the first few rows of planks, fill the gap behind them with his moss and earth mix, tamp it down with a heavy post, then add the next rows of planks. It would be slow. It would be laborious. It would be a wall built not of logs, but of layers. He also redesigned the roof, extending the eaves dramatically to keep snow and rain far away from his new, precious wall system. By the end of summer, he had his materials stockpiled: the squared 6x6 timbers, the stacks of raw planks, and massive dry piles of moss, sawdust, and pulverized clay, all kept dry under oilcloths. He was ready. The work began in the fading light of autumn. It was a strange, almost backward-feeling construction. He was dressing a house that was already built. First, he laid a new stone foundation, a low wall of dry stacked granite, 8 inches out from his existing cabin's base. This was Anselm Muller's wisdom: get the wood off the wet ground. On this, he erected his 6x6 posts, tying them back to the original log walls with stout wooden pegs for stability. This created the skeleton, the 8-inch-wide box that would hold his innovation. Then came the slow, rhythmic labor. He and his mule hauled the planks. He knelt, fitting the first row of rough-sawn pine to the outside of the 6x6 frame. Then he would take buckets of his insulating mix, a carefully proportioned blend of dry, dusty clay, flakes of wood from his axe, and huge handfuls of light, springy moss, and pour it into the cavity. He used a heavy fence post, cut to size, as a tamper. The sound was a dull, satisfying thud, 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 as the mixture compacted into a dense, solid-feeling mass. He would fill the cavity up to the level of the plank, then add the next plank above it, and repeat the process. Thud, thud, thud. It was monotonous, dusty, and backbreaking. His shoulders ached. The dust got into his lungs. But as the wall rose, he could feel the change. When he knocked on the original inner log wall, it gave a hollow thump. When he knocked on the new filled outer section, it was a dead sound, solid and inert, like knocking on packed earth. He was, in effect, building his walls out of natural insulation panels, manufacturing them in place. He worked from dawn until dusk, racing the first snow. Silas would occasionally ride by and just shake his head. "Looks like a damn ammunition bunker, Hatcher. You'll sweat yourself to death in there come summer." Josiah ignored him. He was focused on the feel of the tamped fill. It had to be tight. No air pockets. The windows were the hardest part. He had to build deep angled wooden frames, boxes that would bridge the new, thick wall. When he was done, the windows were recessed almost a foot, giving the cabin the look of a high country fortress. The day he tamped the final layer of fill just under the new roofline and nailed the last plank, a hard, cold wind was blowing from the north. He put his hand on the outside plank. It was ice cold. He went inside. He put his hand on the inner log wall. It was cool, but it was dry. It felt like wood in a woodshed, not wood on a mountain. He hadn't lit a fire in 2 days, but the cabin already felt less hostile. It felt still. The test came in January of 1849. It was a winter that would be spoken of for decades. The year of the deep snow. A blizzard blew in from the north, not a simple storm, but a 3-day siege of wind and fine, scouring ice. The temperature plunged to 30 below zero, and the wind, funneled by the valley, howled at a steady 50 miles an hour. It was a storm that found every weakness, every crack, every lazy bit of craftsmanship. In his standard cabin, Silas and his family were in a fight for their lives. They had hung horse blankets over the north and west walls, but the blankets flapped and moved with the drafts. The air was thick with smoke as Silas and his eldest son fed their fireplace a constant, desperate stream of wood, trying to beat back the cold that poured from the walls. The frost on the inside of their logs was an inch thick. They were cold, terrified, and sleepless. 5 miles up the valley, Josiah Hatcher lit a small fire. He sat on his stool, listening. The wind was a dull, distant roar like a river far away. It wasn't the sharp, intrusive shriek he remembered. It was outside. He stood and walked to the north wall, the one that had once been his tormentor. He placed his bare palm flat against the hewn log. It was completely dry. It was not warm, but it was not cold. It felt impossibly like the air temperature inside the room. There was no draft. There was no frost. He looked at his axe, leaning near the door. The metal was dull and dry, holding the ambient temperature of the cabin. The sheer silence of the room was the most profound change. His cabin had become a pocket of stillness, a null space where the wind had no power. The heat from his small, steadily burning fire wasn't being stolen. It stayed. It built upon itself, creating a stable, livable warmth. He let the fire die down to coals before he went to sleep, a luxury he would never have dared before. He slept under 2 blankets instead of 5. He woke in the morning to a cabin that was cool but not dangerously cold. He had done it. His Hatcher wall had worked. The solid mass of moss, earth, and wood shavings had created a barrier that the cold could not cross. When the storm broke, he emerged into a brilliant, frozen world. He saw Silas's cabin, buried, a weak plume of smoke rising. He knew with a quiet, bone-deep certainty that his simple, crazy idea had just saved his life. The following spring, a humbled Silas visited Josiah's cabin. He walked in and stopped, looking around. The air was calm. "You burned half the wood I did, Hatcher," Silas said, his voice quiet. I nearly lost my boy to frostbite. Show me." Josiah didn't gloat. He took his axe, went to a section of wall he had left unfinished on the inside, a storage pantry, and cut a small inspection hole through the inner log. He pulled out a handful of the insulation. It was bone-dry, light, and springy. "It's the fill," Josiah explained. "The cold hits the outer plank. It tries to get through the fill, but it gets lost. The moss traps the air. The earth stops the wind. By the time it reaches this inner log, it has no fight left." Silas stared at the fistful of dust and moss. That spring, he didn't build a new cabin. He and his sons began building a 6x6 frame around their existing home. The Hatcher Wall had its first convert. As new settlers moved into the high valleys in the 1850s and 1860s, they had a choice: build the quick way like they did back east, or build the Hatcher way. Bodur. Those who built the quick way often suffered terribly in their first winter, or they left. Those who listened to Hatcher, or to Silas, or to the Duns, built their cabins with the thick, formidable double walls. The innovation spread. It adapted. Some, near the new sawmills, used only sawdust for the fill. Others, on the open plains, adapted the principle and built their soddies, using the earth itself. But the core idea, the separation of structure from insulation, the creation of a dead air or filled space, became vernacular wisdom. Decades later, homesteaders in Wyoming and Montana were building filled wall cabins as a matter of course. They didn't know the name Josiah Hatcher. They just knew that this was the right way to build, the only way to stay warm when the wind blew for a month straight. The recessed windows, which Josiah had built out of necessity, became a visual hallmark of a well-built, serious frontier home, a sign that the builder understood the climate and intended to stay. What Josiah Hatcher had done, driven by observation and desperation, was to build one of America's first high-performance, super-insulated walls. He had instinctively grasped three core principles of building science that were a century ahead of their time. The first was the failure of thermal mass. His single-log wall was a thermal bridge, a solid, dense highway for heat to escape and cold to enter. It stored cold and radiated it directly into his home. His second wall solved this. The second principle was R-value, or resistance to heat flow. Hatcher's 8-inch cavity, packed with a low-density mixture of moss, wood fibers, and dry earth, was a primitive form of bat insulation. These materials are effective insulators not because they are warm, but because they are light. They are filled with millions of microscopic air pockets. Air, when it cannot move, which is called convection, is one of the best insulators on Earth. The tamped fill locked the air in place, and this dead air space provided a massive R value. The cold simply could not force its way through that much stabilized air. The third principle was the defeat of infiltration. His original cabin, with its shrinking logs and cracking chinking, was a sieve for wind. The wind would force the warm air out and pull the cold air in. His new wall system presented a complex, multi-layered barrier. The wind might get past the outer planks, but it would hit the 8 inches of dense, tamped fill. Its energy was diffused and stopped long before it could ever reach the inner, structural log wall. His original cabin became, in essence, just the air barrier and interior finish of a new, sophisticated wall assembly. He had turned his walls from a thermal liability into a massive thermal asset. Josiah Hatcher lived in that cabin for another 30 years. He watched the valley fill with homesteaders, then ranchers. He saw the railroad cut a scar through the pass. He was known as Old Man Hatcher, a quiet figure who kept to himself, but whose advice on building, siting a house, or reading the weather was sought by everyone. He was never known to be in a hurry, and he was never, ever cold. His broadaxe, its handle replaced twice, hung by the hearth, its steel dark and silent. The cabin itself outlived him by half a century. It became a line shack for cowboys working the high country herds, who spoke in awe of how a small stove could heat the place in the worst blizzard. It was a place of refuge, its thick walls and deep-set windows a silent testament to a man who had faced a problem and thought his way through it. When the cabin was finally slated for demolition in the 1950s to make way for a new road, the crew foreman, using a modern chainsaw, cut a cross-section through the wall. He stopped his saw, marveling. There, perfectly preserved, was the inner log, flat-hewn by Hatcher's axe. Then the 8 inches of fill still dry, still light, and then the outer sacrificial planks. He was looking at a 100-year-old wall that was, in principle, more advanced than the fiberglass insulated walls of his own house. Josiah had learned what the mountain had tried to teach him. You cannot stop the cold with a single, solid defense. Brute force will always fail. True resilience lies in the system. It lies in the intelligent gap between one wall and another. It lies in using the worthless, humble materials of the earth, the moss, the dust, the air, to create a barrier of stillness. He had learned that a shelter is not just a box to keep the rain off. It is a tool, designed to mediate the relationship between the fragile life within and the overwhelming power of the world outside.